So when we're talking about beauty in this recording, I really mean aesthetic beauty. What does it look like? What does it feel like to be in the space? And from that, probably the first series of principles we can talk about have to do more with the formal composition of the structure, of the facade, or even of the floor plan. And there are a lot of words and principles that one learns in architecture school, and you naturally learn over time as you do more buildings, such as things like contrast, symmetry, hierarchy, order, balance, unity, asymmetry. These kinds of principles are often taught when one is teaching architecture and design, and they're often employed when you're designing a building.
Yeah, because they are tools, right? They are design principles to help you get to creating beauty. It's kind of like if you're a woodworker and you're trying to, I don't know, carve a wooden box out of a block of wood, well, you're going to have like 5 different tools on your workbench, right? Those are kind of the tools that we would use to carve our wood box and make it beautiful. Yeah,
they are things to keep in mind. When I was a student in architecture school, I had these 2 professors when I was I would have been a second-year student, I think, and they came up with this acronym to teach young students about some of these principles. And the acronym was CHOBU, which at the time sounded ridiculous. It still sounds ridiculous, but I guess it worked because I remember it still. And in that case, it stood for contrast, hierarchy, order, balance, and unity. Right. And there's some other words that I listed a few seconds ago, like symmetry. I wrote down also proportion. There's the idea of grids, which is pretty common. But those actually might not have been hierarchy. It might have been harmony. Oh, well, I've forgotten what trouble meant. But anyway, and in that early class, at that point, we weren't doing buildings. We were designing abstract models that were pure composition. And the idea, and one of the exercises was to choose one of these 5 words and create a model, an abstract model that had nothing to do with architecture really, but a physical model that expressed the principles of one of these 5 words. And it was an exercise to train oneself to understand wholly how do you communicate the idea of balance in a composition, just balance. How do you create something, draw something, model something that expresses the idea of contrast, of harmony, of unity, of hierarchy, of order, of whatever it was. And it was a really powerful exercise. Now, when we're designing, or at least when I'm designing, you get to a point very quickly where you don't actively think, I'm going to design this building so it employs the principles of hierarchy and unity. Those are my 2 principles for this building, and that's what I'm doing. That's not really the case. That also highlights your point that these are principles, but they are really used more like subconscious tools. There's skill sets that you have that naturally occur when you're designing. So it's more like you have the ability to see a drawing that you've produced and then critique it and understand it from these different lenses, almost in a subconscious manner, right? Because eventually you get to a point where you don't think about this word, you just feel this doesn't feel right, and it doesn't feel right. And if you were to trace it back to one of these words, you probably could.
It's interesting because if you think about, you mentioned like your teacher in school kind of coming up with this acronym to describe basically like principles to get to beauty. It's very interesting because I'm trying to remember like back in architecture school, if we ever had a class that was kind of addressing how to design beautiful buildings or what is beauty in architecture or how do you even get there. And the only thing that I could think of is, when we had architecture history classes and we would look at, I don't know, like the Greeks or things like that, and like look at the order and like again, it was order, composition, proportion, things that in some ways are still very rational and almost not mathematical, but like geometrical oriented, right? They're not like I don't know, like it looks beautiful, it feels beautiful, it's colorful, it's inexplicable. It was always like very rational in the way beauty was presented.
Yeah.
And that's the only time period I think where beauty seemed to be, now I'm kind of like talking more about like architecture history, right? Like where beauty seemed to be like a big focus was probably like at the time of the Greeks. And then there is eventually like maybe other movements like the Bauhaus movement also had design principles, form follows function, and that's kind of like what to them maybe made a building beautiful, right? Because if it was very efficient. Le Corbusier had also his modular principle of design that to him was going toward his idea of what beauty is.
Yeah, true.
But there was never a kind of like a universal way across time and styles that architecture beauty seems to be taught in school, which is interesting.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. And it touches on a lot of things that beauty in architecture has been defined very, very differently depending on the time that we're in and the era that we're in, the century that we're in. And there's always been this quest in the arts, and architecture is part of that, to figure out a set of principles, a way to discuss and make it into a science, like break down and dissect the building to understand why it's beautiful. And that turns into a set of rules, a set of principles that are often written about in text and with illustrations, which then outlines for someone else to learn. You can learn the orders, the classical orders, and then produce a beautiful building. You could learn Corbusier's 5 principles and his modular man, and then produce a beautiful building. You could learn about the Bauhaus and the methods of construction and efficiency that come with that a set of ideas.
And I think also breaking down those principles maybe was a way to kind of guarantee that you could do it again.
Sure.
Right? Because I think it's maybe easier to create one thing one time that is beautiful. But I think it's probably even much harder to create many things multiple times that each are beautiful.
So given the historical references, I will say that the way we practice, and I think where we are right now in time as a generation, as an era of architecture, is there is not really a set of rules that we all adhere to or follow or believe in. We're kind of past that. I think also, even if we look at society in general, it used to be quite homogenous in different cultures, right? And now we've moved closer and more toward a society that's embraces heterogeneity, right? And architecture is the same way. So we no longer have these classical orders that we should all follow because it's the thing to do. We kind of reject that, again, as a profession and as a practice, but also kind of as a society, right? So beauty and how you create beautiful architecture is been kind of exploded into a bunch of different ways to get there.
And I think that conversation ties back into architectural styles.
Sure.
Right? Because let's say you had, I don't know, Victorian or, I don't know, like Georgian or whatever, American style was there. And I think like those styles, again, were basically applying a rule set of design that produced a certain type of architecture that was telling people this is the standard of beauty of this style.
Yeah.
Right? That was kind of like somebody else had decided that, and that was established, and that was the standard. But the standard of beauty in 2024 is ever changing, and it's different for you, for me, for the person next door,
So, but are you saying that beauty is subjective?
No, I'm not saying beauty is subjective, but I'm saying now it's not so much, let's say, maybe, well, I don't know, it's kind of an abstract question. I feel like before the styles were kind of like someone else, it was telling everybody what beauty was or should be. And we kind of had to pick from a catalog of beauty and be like, this is the beauty that I want, right? And now it's very much like, I don't really care about whoever's telling me what beauty is. I'm going to go with what I think is beautiful, which means, therefore, that there is a whole lot of different beauty available out there depending on people. I'm talking about like homeowners, for example, right? I'm not necessarily saying that a thing that's beautiful to me is not beautiful to you. Like, I do think there is still a baseline of what is beautiful across everyone's taste that still exists.
Yeah.
But there is more color to beauty, let's say.
The way I would describe it, this difference in terms of, again, eras in architecture and where we are now, is that previously there were rules you should follow. There were prescribed rule sets. You could design a building sort of by rote, right? with all the 3 examples or 4 examples that we've given. It's a rule set you follow, and if you follow and you adhere to those things, then it is therefore beautiful.
Yeah.
Like an equation.
Yeah.
It produces beautiful. It equals beautiful. And so there's rules versus principles and tool sets. And so what I'm describing also with the words of proportion, scale, hierarchy, balance, order, unity, symmetry, those are tools. They are not rules to follow. That means some facades that we design employ mostly or embrace mostly maybe 3 of those words I've said. Maybe it's 1 of those words, maybe it's 5 of those words, maybe it's 2 of those words, in whatever combination that it feels appropriate for the building. But they are not rules to follow. No one's telling me that if I have a column of X height, it has to be this wide with a line at here and here. No one's telling me that if I have this color, then I have to have that color, or this material has to be paired with that material, or because of the modular man that Corbusier created, that if I have a shelf at this height, then something else will be. There's none of that. There's no rules. There's nothing dictating what it has to be in the end. There's simply, again, composition ideas to keep in mind and to employ when it feels correct. Now, the real question is, as let's say one who is interested in knowing more about architecture or learning architecture, let's say I have studied all of the 8 different tools and principles we talked about. How do I employ those in a manner where it creates something that's beautiful? That just comes down to practice, and it comes down to seeing and studying a lot of beautiful architecture and artwork. And it's a skill set you just hone over time. That's also why I said earlier, to be honest, as a teacher, some people, they don't have it. And you can see it. They could try for the next 10 years and they're not really going to surpass a certain level. And I don't know why that is. I don't know. I guess if someone's born with it or not born with it, I'm not sure. But there is that space that I think a lot of good architects operate within that make them special and different.
Yeah, no, I mean, even if you look in the street, if you look at fashion, for example, right? There is people who know how to put an outfit together, and there is people who don't.
Yeah.
Right?
Fashion is a very good comparison too, because the rules in architecture, like following the orders, would be very similar to saying, well, in order to design a fashionable and beautiful, wardrobe and attire, it must all be white. This kind of idea, or it has to follow these proportions. And most fashion designers today would be like, no, that's kind of nonsense. Like, that's not the case. And there's also with the idea of beauty, the appreciation for different types of beauty. So we don't have to follow rule sets. So that being said, one question that comes to mind, or other examples of rule sets which are more commonly talked about today, rather than the classical orders, would be things like symmetry. So there are some
That's also
folks
very classical, though.
That it is classical, but it's not quite the order. So the question to you is if something is symmetrical, it employs the principles of symmetry, is it automatically beautiful?
I think symmetry could be perceived as beautiful because there is a sense of composition and calmness to it. I'm not sure that it's enough to make something beautiful. You could have a building, like you could have a suburban home that is symmetrical in the way, the facade is designed. Is it beautiful? No, that's not enough, right? There is another layer to that. So symmetry is a way to get there, but it's not everything. And I think it goes back to one of the compositional tools. Symmetry is one of them, right? Mm-hmm. Like the golden section is another one. Like working from a modular size is another one. But those are just tools. They're not everything, like it's about using the right tool with the right element and kind of like finding the balance and the chemistry between things, and it's not always rational or mathematical.
I mean, I think the idea of symmetry, the idea of the golden section, there's another one which is the rule of thirds. These are probably the 3 most common principles that come up, are often talked about in architecture school, but very briefly. And I feel like they're mostly talked about by people who don't know how to design as a way to shortcut the design process. So what happens is when you're designing something, it's a tricky process where there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of iterating. And I think it's natural for people who don't know how to do that. They want to find something they can latch onto to give them security. So they think about, okay, if I employ the principle of symmetry and I have symmetry in my design, then it will be maybe not completely beautiful, but it'll get me a third of the way there. Okay, now I'm going to employ this other principle. Okay, now I'm more there. So we've had, again, like young architects, let's call them students, and some clients who are like, well, what about the rule of thirds? What about the golden section, the Fibonacci curve, and this and that? And can we do that? Will that make it beautiful? And honestly, I think it's just an attempt for people to try and deconstruct and understand something and make sense of something that they might not understand.
And I think also a lot of those, come from different, let's say, different disciplines even, or can be used for different effects, right? So like the rule of third compositionally, if you do photography, you could use that as a way to compose an image. Mm-hmm. But again, it depends. Like if the image is just a tree and a lake, and the tree is at the 1/3 mark, and the lake is on the right, yeah, that works compositionally. Is it beautiful? No, it's not enough. The symmetry aspect of things is a very classical principle, right? And that was why was I used? That was probably used because it meant order, grandness. Like if you look at a plan or a building or a castle, right? And like the procession is symmetrical. You have two spiral stairs on both sides. It's more dramatic. It's used. The tool is used in a way to get to a certain effect with the result, right? Mm-hmm. So using symmetry for a kitchen, yeah, it's possible. Is it gonna rock the kitchen and make it like beautiful? Probably not. Like that's not enough.
Yeah. So I think that's where the game of creating a beautiful building becomes a bit more complex, because you have all of the dozen different things that we've mentioned that get used in different ways in different times, and sometimes not at all, and different proportions to where it makes sense. And there's no rule to follow to make something beautiful. And I think that's where the mistake happens in people's minds, is that they want, when they're not used to being in a design mode, which is to say they're not used to being lost and confused, right? They grasp to these ideas as a way just to have security. And that's not how we think. That's not how an architect or a designer thinks. It's in fact, to be honest, for us, it's uncomfortable. Like when people ask about that golden section or modules or whatever it might be, I get uncomfortable. I'm like, why are we talking about this? This has nothing to do with the building being beautiful or good in the end. You're just saying stuff because it's also, I have an issue also with, I think it's sort of like this in today's age, this Instagram, TikTok, bite-sized soundbite thing that you can grasp. It's labeled, it's branded. It's this thing that you can grab and hold on to and then stick it over here. Now you've solved the problem, right? It's similar to, in a functional sense, the golden, what do they call it? The golden triangle in kitchen design. And there's definitely some logic to it, and there's definitely reasons why it works, but people obsess over things like that. And I shake my head. I'm like, to me, it's this might sound harsh. I think it's a clear expression of their insecurity and their need to have a very clear, more mathematical understanding of something in order for them to find it valid. Yeah. And that's not how design works. It just doesn't work that way. It tends to be folks who are in those industries, like accountants and engineers, they need stuff like that so they can break it down into numbers. They need numbers. It must be only 4 feet, or at least 4 feet, or at most 4 feet, and then it's good. That's not the case, though. Like there's squish, right, in terms of aesthetic composition, and that's
And I think that's what can beauty be taught to some degree, right? And you could teach it by teaching those principles, and anyone who's not stupid can understand those basic principles of composition and those rule sets, right? Being able to understand them is one thing. Being able to then apply them and use them in a way that makes sense is another thing. And you've already lost like half of the people who learn the principle now can use them. And then you have being able to go beyond those principles to make something beautiful. and then it's only like a tiny percentage of that group that's left and able to do that. There is something about beauty that is more, I think, to me maybe on the elusive and sensibility side that is harder to explain, and that is harder to break down as a recipe to recreate, maybe, you know. Like if you look at art and music even, like I don't know what kind of music makes you feel that it's a beautiful piece of music versus another one. But when I look at art, for example, something to me that would be beautiful, first of all, isn't always necessarily something that I would typically like or would be my style or would be something that I would know I would want. It's kind of usually the opposite. It's something that would be more surprising, more shocking, you know, just like kind of like provoke my emotion in like wakes up my emotion. If something is just kind of like peacefully beautiful, it probably won't captivate me as much. So I would probably say that the art pieces that I would find beautiful are the ones that are like they're grabbing me, you know. They're like I'm obsessed. I have almost like a tension between the piece I'm looking at and my emotions, and I don't necessarily understand it all. And those are also pieces that I would not forget, that I would see in a museum or an exhibition, and I would not forget.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an awe-inspiring factor to something that's beautiful for the most part, but I think you brought up a good point, which is just because something is not of a style or a palette that you personally like doesn't mean it's not beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest difference also, I think, between artists, designers, architects, and folks in those categories versus the average person who maybe hasn't studied those things, is they tend to think about beauty as being closely aligned to or synonymous to what they like and what they find personally to be stylistically in their preferred flavor. And it's just not true. So I think that's also where, you know, in some ways, as I'm thinking about this, people who are studying architecture, students, are very similar to clients in their level of understanding of architecture, which would make sense. And one of the things with students and with clients sometimes is that they are way too strongly tied. Their notions of beauty are too strongly tied to their personal references, which are based on things that they've seen that they've liked. And because they have an affinity toward them, that becomes categorized in their brain, you know, left or right side, that's on the beautiful side as opposed to the ugly side. And they use those references that they like subjectively as a way to judge stuff, as a way to create stuff. And that's I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a very, very limited way to create or understand architecture. So I would say like clients and homeowners and people, general public, who have more exposure to the arts, or they collect photography, or they are photographers, or they collect artwork, or whatever it might be, they tend to have a heightened sense, or they're musicians, they have a heightened sense of what makes this design feel beautiful and work, even if it's not quite their cup of tea. And that's a more productive and more interesting conversation versus some people, they see something and again, oh, it's white, I don't like white. Like, well, there's other things happening here that we should talk about rather than just this one aspect. And I find that for people who are not, again, as educated in the kind of art space, and or they don't just trust the people they're working with, what they are yearning and wanting to go toward is just a regurgitation of something else they've seen. And the things they've seen are not even good a lot of times. It's more like just stuff they happen to like. And again, the idea of liking something versus it being beautiful are completely separate things.
Yeah, and I think the distinction comes in the fact that you are indirectly doing like an appropriation of the thing, right? It's like, do I see myself like living in this space? Do I see myself like buying this thing? Does that represent me? You know? And I think that's where you know, the other group of people kind of like is able to not project themselves into that specific object architecture or style, and just more objectively or more sensibly look at it for what it gives as emotion.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's like when people travel to places in different countries, there's people who enjoy and find things beautiful like all across the world, and even if it's not, you know, where they would live, what they would wear, what they would eat, like they find beauty in the diversity of those things because of different reasons, right? And there is the other group of people who travel the world and they're complaining the food is not like the food that they have at home. You know, like people wear like weird outfits and their houses are not as good as ours. And, you know, and it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like in the way you appreciate and you look and your outlook on things. It's kind of that is, are you being a bit more objective or are you just like being in your lane?
Yeah, there is an appreciation and understanding for what the thing is. Its inherent character, its inherent truthfulness and honesty for what it is and what it's trying to express. And if it has integrity, then I think the well-traveled person will understand the beauty of that thing. The person who is, let's say, not well-traveled or not open-minded will just reject it again because, well, I don't like that flavor, so it's bad. Well, you know, I mean, another comparison is probably to food, right? I'm sure if you spoke with, you know, a top chef, they have a great appreciation for all different kinds of food. And not just because of the flavors that they prefer and the cuisines they prefer, but because they understand the complexity of the composition that makes up X dish. Even if they wouldn't have it every day or they wouldn't have it for breakfast as their preference, they can understand the beauty of what's happening there. And the same thing applies to architecture.
I think the same thing applies for clients, you know, like, you know, sometimes you have clients who know exactly what they want. And it's kind of like, okay, well, but is that beautiful? You know, or is it not beautiful? And before you reject something, did you look at it and find if there is maybe something that you find beautiful in it that could be used in another way rather than rejecting it completely? Because I think if you keep an open mind to what beauty is or could be, you could discover things that you were not expected in your own standard of beauty, right? And therefore, you can kind of deviate from the pre-established standard in your head of what beauty is.
Yeah, so that also reminds me, again, the distinction between style and beauty. And when we are designing things, I don't ever really think about the style too much. Maybe perhaps because the general stylistic aesthetic direction we're in is already set. Like we don't do classical things. We don't do like pseudo Spanish, whatever they call it, Spanish, Tuscany, Italian villa. People always mixing words too. It's like I'm doing it's sort of like Tuscany with a little bit of like French chateau, and you look at it, it looks like a cheesecake factory. Like, okay.
And I'm like, Tuscany is there, France is there,
you don't know
and
what
Spain
you're
is
talking
there.
about. Like this is, and it plagues California, all these kind of ideas. So, you know, we don't do that stuff. So we do have kind of a direction, I suppose, but I don't think about it like, oh, I'm trying to create this style. I guess beauty would be more the thing we're heading toward. And it's not like I consciously think I'm trying to create something beautiful, because obviously that's a goal. But I do find that's also a distinction, right? And style tends to imply also superficialness to a degree. It also gets close to the idea of trends, and which gets close to the idea of what's favorable in a very short period of time. And that's also the mistake, or the difference, is that some people see it only that way and they want to copy and paste. Well, I saw that. Can we put that over here? Put this into the project? Or they saw all of these, like in probably across the world, but in California, at least right now, for the last probably decade, all white houses that are all white inside and outside with black trim. That's like the thing, right? And it when it first occurred, it was relatively new and it felt interesting and good, but now it's been worn out. But that's just an example of people seeing all that stuff and liking it for some reason, valid or not valid, and then saying, why don't we do the same thing over here? When that is an inauthentic way to produce a work of art. It's inauthentic to have a superficial aesthetic goal in mind. That's not how designing something takes place. You have to let it evolve into what it wants to be, understanding the core formal composition principles of hierarchy, balance, symmetry, order, proportion, and all of these things. In terms of music, it's an interesting thing because I think the strongest comparisons between music and architecture are the former ones. So in music, there's the idea of rhythm, space, silence in music is super important. It's as important as the notes themselves for sure. You have ranges, you have softness, and you have loudness. You have speed. You have all of these things. You can even extend it further. You have motifs. You have things that repeat, and then are variations, themes and variations. There's like the entire lexicon of music can be applied directly to architecture. And probably for myself, because I have a bit of a music background, I think that if I think about it, I probably inherently and subconsciously think of any architecture I'm looking at in that manner. It's not conscious. I don't make conscious comparisons when I'm looking at stuff or designing stuff, but I think it's for sure there. And sometimes, and you know this because we work together, when I see something I don't like, I don't even use words. I'll be like, da 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 da, and like I don't know if that makes sense to anybody.
And I'm like,
but that's like, or when you're drawing, it's like a line and then dashes, or it's a hard line and a soft line, a hard line that turns up, and the turn that goes up is not a soft turn; it's a doink doink. It's strong, or maybe it's two separate lines, which is different, or maybe the lines intersect, which is a different thing too. So that
explains a lot of your sketches.
Yeah, so like even when you're sketching something, right? How, let's say, two lines that are different degrees, 90-degree difference, right? How they are drawn with a pencil or a pen indicates very different emotions and relationship between those two lines. Again, is it a continuous one? Is it a curved one? Are they two separate ones that intersect? Is one thick? Is one thin? Is one a bunch of strong lines? Is there a gap between them? These are fundamentally completely different things in terms of the composition of these two elements. Now, I've probably said like maybe 5 different relationships between these two lines, and there's probably another 5, and that's just with 2 lines. So when you think about the composition of a building, which is composed of like 100,000 lines, there's a lot to consider. But anyway, so the music is probably how I think about architecture formally more than anything else. The thing also I feel that's very interesting with music that translates to architecture, but in a less obvious way, is the tonality of sound. So in music, there's the idea that if you have a note, and it's a note, it's not just that note. It can be shaped, and not just in volume from loud to soft or loud to soft or soft to loud. It itself has shape. So if you imagine that a note is a 3-dimensional kind of, I don't know, beam of sort, you cut a section through it, right? And there's a circle that is the section of the note. The note can feel very hollow, and that section is hollow, like, I don't know, it's a wiffle ball kind of thing. It can feel very solid and rich. It can feel heavy. It can feel bright. It can feel dark. It can feel many, many different things. And a note sometimes will feel like it's made of pure, solid, rich, thick, heavy gold. And other times it feels like it's made of tinfoil. And I think there's, in that, again, the tone and the shape of the note and the darkness and the lightness and brightness is not as easily transferable consciously to architecture. The same as like rhythm. Well, we can think of the rhythm of facade, the rhythm of a piece of music. That's like easy to understand. But the shape of a note is a different thing. But I still think it does apply to architecture. It does apply to architecture, and maybe if I'm thinking about it, it's more about the materiality and the texture in architecture, maybe. But I think there's something there, for sure.
I wish I knew music so I could understand this better.
It's like, I played the trumpet. That was my instrument. So I don't know. This would only make sense to trumpet players. But, you have like Arturo Sandoval, and you have Al Hirt, and you have Doc Severinsen, and you have Miles Davis. You have Louis Armstrong, and you have Don Ellis. And each of those people playing the same instrument, playing the same notes in the same order, sound completely differently, even if the rhythm was the same, right? So what's left? What's left is the texture, I guess, sort of the materiality and the weight of the note. I think it's really interesting. I was sticking with the music comparison. Just one other example was that, with string instruments, which I never played a string instrument, but I know that there's I forget what they call it. I think it's a downstroke and an upstroke. Like when you use the bow, you go two directions, obvious, with the bow, and there's a down and an up, and so you're playing the same note in both directions, but the downward one has a downward feeling to it. It feels different. Not just when you're playing it, but it sounds different. It feels downward. And the up feels upward. It feels light. It feels up. And I think there's definitely that same thinking in architecture. You have a wall. Is that wall going into the soil? Do you feel that it's embedded in the soil? Or do you feel like the wall is floating off of the soil or has a lighter touch on the soil? And that can be applied to a bunch of other things too. But there's a richness to the, again, the vocabulary that's used in music and the feeling in music, especially I think when you're playing it viscerally, that can be applied, that is applied to architecture. For me, it's right there. They're the same thing.
So what again, like my question was, what does make a piece of music beautiful to you versus not?
I certainly have preferences for things. I think it really gets back to the larger statement of if it's trying to do, if it's honest in whatever it's trying to do, and if it feels authentic, then it's probably good music. And it doesn't really, again, have to do with the style of the music. It doesn't mean that if it's pop, I don't like it, or if it's rap, I don't like it. It just has to do with just the honesty of what it's trying to achieve. And it doesn't mean that a piece of music has to have a lot of notes and be super complex. It can be very, very sparse. The same thing with architecture. You can have a very minimal architecture and I can find it beautiful. I can see architecture that's super complex and has a lot of pieces to it. I can find it beautiful. And on both ends of the spectrum, I've certainly seen many examples where they're not good. They're not good at all.
It's interesting too, because also you can imagine, like, if you use beautiful elements, would that make, the building beautiful?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is no, of course.
The answer is no.
Yeah.
I think there is a lot of those, shortcomings in doing that too. Like we talked about, like kind of like the formal composition being somewhat an illusion of beauty because it's not enough. I think it's the same thing with like using expensive materials or expensive, appliances or windows or hardware. Is that going to make it beautiful? Well, the piece itself is beautiful. Is it making the overall composition beautiful? Probably not. It's the same with music, right? Like you can use the most expensive guitar and play the piece, but if you're not doing what you're doing with what you just described with the notes,
you can have also the best musicians if the composition that they're playing from is not good, then it doesn't work, and that's probably what I'm thinking as well. It's sort of like, even in TV and in film, you can have the best actors, the best sets, the best CGI, the best wardrobe and costume designer. If the script sucks, you can't, everyone knows this, right? In film and TV, you can't overcome a bad script. It's not possible. The same thing applies, I think, in architecture. You can't overcome the poor arrangement and connections and relationships between items. You can have the nicest marble in the world. If it's not used correctly, it makes no difference at all. And how... I was thinking also going back to music, that in music, there's definitely science behind it. There's an understanding of chords, which I understand a little bit, but not a whole lot. And you play different notes, they resonate a certain way with each other in your ear, and they feel and sound a certain way. So there are like principles. There's a science to it, of course, right? I think in architecture, those principles exist, but they're a little bit looser because... And in our case, it wouldn't be, how two notes interact. It would be about how two surfaces or materials interact, and they're tectonic. So tectonics is another word that's used in architecture a lot, which is basically the study, the science, the employment of how things, two physical things relate or don't relate, how they are attached or not attached to each other, that connection, right? That joint, is it a bracket? Is the bracket exposed? Is it hidden? What does that bracket look like? Is it a pin? Is it many, many different things? And so probably the tectonics of architecture gets to the specific relationships between stuff, and is now that I think about it, probably one other aspect of architecture that non-architects don't think about or don't see as being critical to creating a beautiful building. The tectonics have to be sound. And I don't mean structurally, like sound, as in it's going to stand up in an earthquake. That it does, yes. But I mean that it makes sense, again, for the overall statement it's trying to employ. Is the project about floatingness and gaps between elements? Or is the project about solidity and things being firmly morphed together so they become one thing? Or is it about expressed connectivity, so the steel connections between different beams and posts is heavily expressed as part of the aesthetic, and that's part of the spirit of the project? It was a lot of a lot of things to unpack with tectonics.
So there is other things in architecture that could be employed to create beauty, right? And those are things that maybe people might not necessarily think about if they're not architects, or might not think that it really contributes to create beauty. But I think, like, for example, like daylight or artificial lighting, like light in a space, is what can make a space almost magical and therefore beautiful, or the complete opposite.
Yeah.
Like let's say if you go and you visit a church, what's going to make the church beautiful or magical, or you're going to have that awe moment, is the light. Yeah. How the light is going to penetrate the shell, the building, right? And I think that's very much undervalued, because it's not a trend. It's not something that, people are bragging about. Like it's kind of like maybe one of the tools that architects used, that's not out there, known about, but that is one of the main and also fairly basic tools that we use in order to make architecture beautiful.
Basic, but also it's one of the aspects of architecture that is not done well by novice architects because it's a bit more elusive, right? When we think of materials themselves, so brick versus wood versus concrete, well, everyone can imagine concrete, everyone can imagine brick and glass and wood, and you can see it, you can hold it, it's there. And you can look at it and say, I like it, I don't like it, it works for this palette, it doesn't work for that palette. But light is a much more difficult thing to comprehend because it's ephemeral, it's changing, it's shifting, it's kind of amorphous in a sense. But you're correct that light is critical. And this also, you can compare architecture to photography in that sense. If you talk to any photographer, you ask them, what's the most important thing in terms of creating a beautiful photograph? Light. Hands down, 100 out of 100 photographers will say light. If we're just talking about the aesthetic beauty, not like the intention of the photograph, it's light. It's always light. And that's also why when you learn photography, you typically start off by learning black and white photography, because you remove all that material stuff. You remove the color, the greenery, the browns, the blues, and you just talk about the core essence, the first principle of light. And that's also why, thinking about it, when one is studying architecture, you don't start off by creating abstract models and buildings with an understanding of materials. You start off with they're just pieces of cardboard, and that's it. There's no, and maybe there's an understanding of, actually not. The first models, there's not even glass. It's just cardboard. It's just form and space and mass and space and walls and space. There's only two things. And then therefore how light enters this thing or moves around it.
You're right. Like if you look at black and white photography, like if you do have the light, like the strong blasting light on the subject, or like a strong shadow, you start talking about the contrast and the different nuances of like blacks and grays and whites, and where the delineation is, and how does the light touches the subject and outlines it or differentiates it from like the background or the foreground. And it is actually a very powerful tool, because color, is pretty complex and magical as well. But if you just look at the light, you can achieve a lot just with that. So, again, it goes back to using expensive materials and expensive like little features and sprinkles. You can go as basic as good architecture and good light, and that could be it to make something beautiful.
It's funny. So we talk to a lot of architects, obviously. We have a lot of architecture friends. All of our friends are architects. And a common question for fun is, who's your favorite architect? And one of the most common answers is Louis Kahn. And if you don't know who Louis Kahn is, look him up. Louis Kahn had typically a very, very restrained material palette, as a lot of famous architects have in the past for good or bad reasons. And what he's most known for is his formal composition and the use of light. So the favorite projects that always come up by him, aside from the Salk Institute, which is more of an outdoor space generally, we could say, is their Orange Chapel in France, and what is it? It's the museum in Texas. The Kimball Art Museum.
Yeah.
Both of those are the most important quality of both of those works is probably the light. It's just the light. And we don't even talk about materials. Yes, there's concrete. I think one is like stucco, but no one ever talks about the materials of those projects. It's the light.
Yeah. Right?
And I would have to say too, strangely, a lot of times we take over projects from, we get clients who are looking to replace their architect. I don't know why that's the case. So we've seen drawings and things from other architects. And the thing that's missing from the thinking is the light. It's kind of a weird thing because it's like one of the fundamental primitive aspects of existing as anything on this planet Earth is the light. And yet it's never shown. Like, so when I see drawings, elevation drawings of the outside or the inside, like, where's the light?
Or sometimes it's too much light too, which could be bad,
Yeah.
Like too much light could just destroy your project. So it could go both ways.
It's it reminds me that in one of the projects, actually two of the projects we're looking at recently, the last couple of weeks, there was a discussion of where to locate this item. And I think it was a stair in one of the projects, and there were pros and cons to locating the stair over here or over there. And there's a lot of pros and cons to it. And if we were just talking about, forget function for a moment, that was part of the conversation, obviously, but forget function. Let's say we're just talking about the beauty of the composition, the beauty of the space. Where does the stair want to go? And there were strengths and weaknesses to both locations we were debating between. But one of them, the one that we ended up with, and a large part had to do with we know how the sun is going to move, and we know that for the majority of the time during the day when the sun is up, the light is going to cascade along this wall where we want to locate the stair. And that was a big factor in knowing where the stair should go, because the stair in this case was meant to be kind of a centerpiece and all this other stuff. The stair, if we didn't think about the light, is a completely different stair if it doesn't get sunlight. And it's the same thing with this outdoor courtyard space that we were reflecting on the other day. If we locate this wall of the courtyard and it faces south, that wall is going to get sunlight. It's going to activate the courtyard. Versus if you imagine that wall having no sunlight at all, then that courtyard would be very different. So, just thinking out loud, I actually think it's I don't think it's thought about enough generally. And I also think that's where, using the tools we have these days, like apps to track the sun or geolocating the building accurately to where it is in the world, and understanding where north is, basic principles, but super impactful to understand whether or not the building works. You can have a building that looks like it works. If the sun doesn't move in the way you anticipate it, it doesn't work. It doesn't, especially when you get to the interiors, I think, and you're trying to create dramatic moods for light to be cast across the wall or to appear like as a tiny strip for whatever reason. If the sun is actually not there, that doesn't work.
It's funny. I feel like the light could bring drama to us, but in a good way. Right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it is a little bit overlooked. The other thing is, of course, talking about beauty and architecture, is materials and texture. Those are a big one. And it could, again, you could use the simplest materials or the most complex materials. It really depends how and where you're using them.
Yes, I agree. I think materials is also one of those examples of an item that's very easy for people to think about in a more superficial manner if I like it or I don't like it. Like I've heard so many times from people, I don't like brick. And I'm like, right, well, when you say brick, I know what you're thinking of. I know you're thinking of the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, and you're thinking of the brick house. You're thinking of the classic brick in a stack pattern.
I think my mom actually doesn't like brick, like red brick.
Huh?
I think my mom doesn't like red brick.
Right.
And I think because it's associated with a memory of her childhood or something, you know?
Sure. And look, everyone has their own personal, let's say, quirky likes and dislikes based on probably old memories. And that's fine. I'm not going to argue with that. But to dismiss the brick is a very silly thing to do, because there are 1,000, if not more, versions of brick and how we use brick. And so I think materials is one of those things where it's easy for people to just dismiss it. And it also highlights the fact that not only can a material, when we're using generic terms like brick or wood or whatever else, can be very different from one case or another, it also is very different depending on the context that it's in and the design around it. A dark wood flooring. Ew, I don't like dark wood flooring. Okay, well, do you like it in this context? Yeah, it looks great over there. Okay, well, then maybe we need to rethink this idea of you just don't like all dark wood flooring, right?
Yeah.
And that's also, I think, it's a challenge to kind of overcome those essentially preconceptions that we have about these labels for materials. Maybe it's me, but that's also I don't like labels. I hate labels. I don't like people saying that they don't like brick or that we must employ the golden section or must have symmetry. Like these are just labels you're using to partition things. It's not necessary. Let's exist in the messy stew.
Right. I think something else that makes architecture beautiful is, of course, the context. And I think sometimes it's funny because I'm thinking of, all of the beautiful projects being published nowadays, right? And how much of those beautiful projects being published are beautiful because the context is beautiful versus is the building beautiful? I mean, I'm not saying that those projects are beautiful. A lot of them are, but a lot of them also are just okay. They're just made beautiful because there is an amazing natural open landscape, in the background, right? So it's a little bit of a trick, which also tells me that you could have a building that is beautiful in a context that might not look like much, but maybe in the way they both intersect and interact is beautiful.
There is a very important aspect of architecture, which is the ability for the building to respond to its site, its immediate site that it's in, the climate and the topography and the adjacent structures and all that stuff. And by respond, I use the word respond because it doesn't mean it has to blend in, it doesn't mean it has to stand out, but it needs to have a clear response that it's making that makes sense for what it's doing.
I'm thinking like, okay, if you take the obvious, falling water, right?
Okay. Falling Water by Frank
Lloyd
Wright.
Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. Right. Look at the context. It's a forest. Yeah. There is water that's falling. Yeah. There is rocks.
Yeah.
It could probably look like any forest that has water and rocks. Honestly, it's not, it's not the Amazonian. It's not the jungle. It's not anything like incredible, but it has some sort of potential, right? Mm-hmm. And the way the architecture is interacting and intersecting with that context is what is making the architecture beautiful.
True.
Like if you take falling water out of the falling water and put it in like on a flat site, would it be beautiful? It'd probably be okay. I mean, it would be a nice suburban home, right?
If you zoomed in to just see the building in no context, you'd say, yeah, this is great. But then as soon as you zoomed out to the context, you'd say, this makes no sense.
So it's kind of like, for this specific example, I think what makes it beautiful is that almost a kind of a clash between the context and the architecture. That's what makes it magical and special.
One of my favorite topics in architecture is the relationship between architecture and nature and the natural landscape. I think there's just there's so many ways to deal with that relationship. And again, it spans from camouflaging on the extreme end to complete rejection of one another and complete, almost like just contradictory and contrasts between the two. And I think it's a very rich area of study within the practice, within the art of architecture.
Now, if you live in like a flat land, with 3 trees around, like the context isn't necessarily as rich or has maybe has much of a potential.
It would appear so.
But there's always ways you can extract things from the context to create beauty in architecture.
Always.
Even a building in the desert could be beautiful in that desert, specific context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's context at that scale. I think also cultural context is a very, very, very important one, because different cultures across our current place and time have different standards for what is considered aesthetically pleasing. And certainly, again, if we look back in time across history, that's a different way to think about cultural context as different eras in history and architectural history. And cultural context is super critical. I think it also that quickly goes over into the function of a building and what people feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. People live very differently in different places, and the house, what we perceive and what we think of as a house in Western countries is very different from Eastern countries and different from other places. And even within Western countries, it's entirely different. But anyway, so more in the aesthetic and the beauty portion of the conversation. Cultural context it's critical. I think also what's fascinating, probably because of the internet actually, is that there's been sort of a flattening of aesthetics across the world in terms of contemporary and modern architecture. So you'll see similar palettes and styles being employed from one place to the next, or similar kind of thinking. Which I think can be productive, but can also be very dangerous. Mm-hmm. So I don't have much to say on the cultural context aspect of things, except for that it needs to be thought about. And it's something that we always think about when we're stepping into a new place. But I think part of our job and part of the reason why people hire us, is to push the boundaries of the standard norms. But you don't want to push boundaries by doing something that is just trying to be rebellious and reject the cultural norms. You kind of want to take those cultural norms and push them further in their kind of evolution, if that makes sense, rather than trying to be combating them. And that's kind of that's more detail, but that's kind of the real question, I think, when you're designing something in a different place. You're not trying to be different just to reject what's right around it. You're trying to be different as a way to evolve the traditions that exist. And that's maybe a different conversation.
And then the last thing I think is movement. How does one move in the building? I think there is something that could be very basic and not particularly, enchanting or extraordinary. There could also, the procession itself could be what makes the building amazing, because it is how you perceive it, how you experience it, how you discover it.
Yeah.
And the same with light. I think those two are kind of like disregarded most of the time, because of, maybe because of conventions and standard, like, window must be this size and you must have a hallway here and an entrance there and a second exit over here, and that's kind of like the movement through the house.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that.
I think it's also one of the things that's less obvious. Again, like, people can look at a brick and decide whether or not they like that brick or don't like that brick, and whether or not they've seen it before. But looking or experiencing a house and talking about movement and circulation in the house, the circulation of people, it's not really commonplace. But in architecture school, when you're studying architecture, one of the first things you learn how to do is diagrams. And a diagram is, as you'd imagine, is a drawing that depicts a certain aspect of the building. And the most fundamental diagrams, there's a program diagram, the understanding of where different functions go. There's a sometimes light diagrams, and there's circulation diagrams. Like the circulation diagram, the flow of people, is probably like the second or third diagram you learn in like first or second year. And it's not something that the general public necessarily knows about or thinks about. But how you move in a space will dictate how it feels and dictate whether or not it's beautiful in the experience. And we talked about this a lot before, but that's probably the biggest mistake, the most, the primary reason why a lot of houses we've been in feel terrible is probably circulation and then light, those two. It's not, the aesthetics, that the cabinetry is old. Like, that's not what's making this space feel bad. It feels bad because the circulation sucks.
If you look at like why people are remodeling their homes, in most cases, it is these two. The house is too dark and the rooms are too like box within a box within a box, and it doesn't flow well. Those are the two things. And what are people doing? They're putting big windows and they're opening up walls, and they're changing how you move around the spaces.
And the way that we choreograph movement is also, again, it doesn't follow a set of rules. Not every house has to have a room where the kitchen faces the living room or is open to the living room, like a big, great room, vacuous open space. A lot of times that's the case with how we live nowadays, but not always. How you enter the house is not like a set rule set. So that procession through the house is choreographed, it is designed, it's with intention, and it follows the idea of the project. Not so that just it generically feels good, but it's part of the intention of the project. Is the project about formal symmetry and having clear sight lines all the way through from the front to the back? Or is it about meandering? Or is it about somewhere between the two? Or is it about three separate processions that are different chapters in the story of the project as you move through it? They're different things. And that has to be, I would put it up there with light. It's one of those things that's not thought about nearly enough. It would be like, creating a movie, but not thinking about how the camera moves from one place to the next. It's like designing a movie by having really cool sets and scenes, but not thinking about how does the camera move within the scenes and between the scenes. Yeah. Like that
doesn't make sense.
It's a big part of it. I mean, it doesn't work without it. It goes back again. You can have all the material stuff, and you can have all the principles, right, of the formal stuff, but if the movement of the people in the space doesn't feel right and doesn't follow a logic for the project, it doesn't work.
I think that's where the roles of the architects kind of come in, is to orchestrate, all of those different elements. Because one could think like, okay, well, I know I need this, I need that, so therefore I could do it myself, or it's not that hard. But it is what we do. It is orchestrating everything.
Yeah, and I think that's also why the tendency these days for people to want to separate and partition interior design from architecture as distinct things is just silly. I don't think that's the case, and it also doesn't mean that everything has to be fluid. Again, moments of like rhythm, again, stopping and repetition and breaks and space and gaps in the movement and jolts, like these are important things to understand when crafting circulation.
Any final thoughts on architecture and beauty?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff. We actually covered more than I thought we were going to.
Is there one thing that to you makes a building beautiful? That's like maybe stronger, like like when you're, I don't know, visiting the world and looking at buildings, if there is like some that kind of like captivate you a bit more? Aesthetically,
it's again probably thinking with different lenses of all the words we use at the very beginning, right? Proportion, balance, hierarchy, all that stuff. Materiality comes into there too. Materials are a way also to create the sensation of all those words without actually changing the shape of an item. So there's that. I think in a bit of a more conceptual manner, I think it's as long as the building or the artwork or whatever it is again being clear and honest with the expression of its intent, then to me, it is automatically beautiful. No matter what the material is, no matter what the medium is, no matter what the style is, it doesn't matter. If it expresses integrity for its artistic statement, then it is beautiful. That's, I think, the only, in my view, that's the only, truthful, fundamental definition of beauty that can exist across space and time. That's the only one that can exist. And I think it's the more that people can embrace that understanding of beauty, probably the more diversity of architecture we'd have, and probably the more open-minded and accepting we would all be of other forms of art and cultures, to be honest, right? I don't have to like something to appreciate the beauty of that thing. Whatever that might be, whether it be architecture, art, food, cultures, people, right? It's probably more about the integrity of the expression than anything else.
I was thinking about that thing earlier where I was like, well, maybe to me what makes the difference between a building versus architecture is if the building is beautiful. And by that, I feel like I would find a building beautiful, again, if it provokes my emotion. And a building that doesn't provoke any emotion to me is not architecture, it's just a building.
Do you mean good emotion?
Yeah, good emotion. Well, yeah, good emotion. Maybe also bad emotion, I don't know. Well,
you have plenty of buildings you don't like, so.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I think good emotion. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily categorize those. But I think a building that doesn't provoke any emotion if I look at it or visit it, to me, it's just a building.
I mean, the most obvious example that comes to my mind is a church or a spiritual place, right? That's often the type of architecture where it's very emotional for people because of we know what it is and what it means, yes, but also just the space itself visually, right, is oftentimes packed full of emotion, because that's kind of what they're intended to do also, is create a sense of awe or contemplation,
But even a house, I mean, I could go to an open house and see 10 houses, and maybe one of them is going to give me some emotion. And most of them probably won't give me anything.
Yeah, and I was thinking about some houses we saw recently, and it has nothing to do with style or the materials or the palette or the things themselves. Like we were visiting a house that was for sale. It's modern. It has a lot of glass, floor-to-ceiling glass. It has nice wood floors. It has, it has like greenery throughout it. It has a really big open kitchen, a big island. It has clean detail. It has all the stuff that you would typically think would be aligned with our personal preferences. I didn't like it though.
Well, I think it didn't have a soul. And maybe the soul comes from the beauty itself. I don't know, but you can kind of feel when a building has let's say, a personality versus not.
Mm-hmm.
Like
that's why the way I phrase it is integrity, or it's an honest expression of something or character. I'm always saying that buildings are like people, and we like the people who are who they are. Yeah. You might not agree with them on everything. They might not be a person you want to hang out all the time, but you inherently love them to a degree because they are very honest to what they're being. Aside if they're assholes, and that's like a different thing. But if they're honest to where they are, it feels right. And I think the same thing goes for any, thing that we create.
So my last question, what that's going to be?
No.
What is your favorite building in terms of beauty? And don't ask me that question. I don't have an answer.
I don't know. That's a really difficult one because there's so many different ones. For some reason, the first one that came to mind was the Pompidou Center. I don't know why that came to mind. I think it came to mind because it's an extreme example of something that's beautiful and is a very specific taste, right? And it's a good example of when it first came out. If the French, as they did, would go around the news reports and do polls of people in the street, like, what do you think of the new Pompidou Center? And you get some people who are like, yeah, I love it because it's different. And you get people who hate it. Oh, it's so dumb looking. It's this and that. And I think it's just a good example of you can have a building that triggers folks to feel they love it or they hate it. But I think for any architect and any artist, anyone who's in creative industry, even a musician, you can't deny that it's beautiful, right? It is beautiful, even if aesthetically you might hate it completely.
I also don't know if asking an architect his favorite building and what is beauty is the best, because we are looking at buildings in a way that most people don't look at buildings.
But more people should look at buildings the way we do. Again, it's this objective, somewhat, I wouldn't say distanced as in like being inhuman, but it's again, you're appreciating the thing for what it is. It's like when you go to a restaurant, it's a certain type of restaurant. Like I might not eat it every day, but this is beautiful what you're doing and what has been done, and it tastes good. Like it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's it. I agree with you. I think people should look at buildings more the way we do than not. And I think also people should wonder if buildings are beautiful or not, why they are beautiful or not, and again, if a building is architecture or not.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, why don't we wrap it up and you give us an outro?
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. Hopefully, we got your brain going about what beauty in architecture is or mean. If you like what we do, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. We're on most other podcast platforms as well. You can find us on social media, Second Studio Pod. We have the website, secondstudiopod.com. We have the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can text or leave a voicemail. And that's it. We have a lot more coming up. So keep tuning, keep sharing, keep listening, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, you can find our office is out there as well on all the different platforms also.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.